"Uncle, I know where my little sister is," said the beggar girl to the police officer at the station. "Before we begin, take a moment and drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Let's embark. On this journey together, Madison Miller was only 8 years old, but she had an old soul. Her eyes, bright yet weary, seemed to carry the weight of the world, one she had never chosen. The streets of Southgate, a neglected part of town, buzzed with the usual hum of traffic and distant chatter, but there was an air of something darker, something unsaid. It was late afternoon when Madison walked to the old brick building that housed the police station. Her little legs carried her purposefully, though her heart was heavy. The late sun cast long shadows on the pavement, but her small face was determined. She had to tell them what she knew, though no one would believe her. No one ever did. But she knew. She always knew. Inside the station, Blake Montgomery, a weary detective, looked up as the door creaked open. He was used to all sorts of visitors, witnesses, suspects, even the occasional frantic parent. But the child who walked through the door that day was different. Her gaze was steady, too steady for someone her age, and her words that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I know where my sister is," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake blinked, taken aback. The girl was only 8, yet her eyes seemed to see far more than most adults ever did. "What do you mean, honey?" he asked softly, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "She's not gone." "I know where she is," Madison repeated, her voice firmer now. She's waiting for me." The words hung in the air, making the room feel colder than it should have. Blake's brows furrowed. This wasn't the typical behavior of a child reporting a missing sibling. He'd heard a lot over the years, but nothing like this. "Your sister, Lily? She's been missing for over a month," he said, his voice steady, but the unease growing. "Are you sure?" Madison nodded. "I know where she is. She's close, but you have to listen to me." Blake's gaze shifted, his concern deepening as he looked at her arms. Beneath the sleeves of her faded sweater, he could see dark bruises, a collection of marks that spoke of more than just mischief or playground falls. It was a story he'd seen too many times before, but never in someone so young. He stood up quickly, his pulse quickening. "Are you hurt?" he asked, more urgently now. Madison shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "She's not far. I'll show you where. But you have to promise me something." Blake's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts telling him there was something deeply wrong here, something more sinister than just a missing child. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain control. "What do you need me to promise, Madison?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Don't let them stop me," she said quietly, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a suffocating cloud. "I need to find her before it's too late." Blake hesitated, confusion and fear warring within him. He didn't know what to believe anymore, but something in Madison's voice told him she was not just a scared child. She was a messenger. "I'll help you," Blake said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe." "No," Madison said quickly, her small voice urgent. "I'm not scared. I need you to find Lily before they do." Blake's mind raced as he processed her words. He was a seasoned detective, hardened by years of experience, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. The way Madison spoke, the fear in her eyes, it was more than just a missing child case. This was something else, something far darker. His thoughts were interrupted as Madison turned and began walking towards the door. Without a word, she led him outside, her pace unhurried, but determined. Blake followed, trying to make sense of what was happening. They walked through the streets of Southgate, where the buildings seemed to close in on them, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. As they approached the old, crumbling house on the corner, Blake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This is where she is," Madison said softly, stopping in front of the house. "I'll show you. But you have to promise, Blake. You have to listen." Blake looked at the run-down house. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he looked at Madison. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he knew it was going to change everything. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Let's go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole, but Blake couldn't look away from Madison. There was a strength in her that was both unsettling and captivating. She led him through the house, her small hands gripping the door frames for support. When they reached the back room, Blake's breath caught in his throat. The room was empty. There was no sign of Lily, but something else caught Blake's eye. Scratches on the floor, a broken chair, and bloodstains that had long since dried. The room felt like a tomb. Madison stepped forward, her voice trembling. "She was here, I swear it." Blake knelt down, running his fingers over the floor. He felt the coolness of the air shift, as if something unseen was watching them. "Why are you here, Madison?" Blake whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Who else knows about this place?" Madison didn't answer. She just looked at him with those wise eyes, and for the first time, Blake felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread. He didn't know what this was or what was going to happen next, but he knew he was no longer just investigating a missing persons case. This was something far darker. As he turned to leave the room, a sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. A faint, muffled cry. Blake froze, his heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. It was Lily. Blake's heart skipped a beat as the faint cry echoed through the abandoned house. It was a sound so fragile, so broken, that it nearly shattered his composure. He looked down at Madison, who had gone eerily still. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto the space where the sound had originated, as if she could hear something he couldn't. "Lily," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. His pulse raced as he stood up, instinctively moving toward the sound. Madison's small hand shot out, gripping his sleeve with surprising force. "No, don't go there," she pleaded softly. "It's not safe." Blake looked down at her, confusion and concern mingling in his chest. "What do you mean it's not safe? We have to find her, Madison." Madison pulled him back, her face strained with fear, but her voice remained calm, almost eerily so. "You don't understand. They're waiting. They've been waiting." The words hung in the air, chilling Blake to his core. He had seen his share of dark cases, missing children, gang violence, and domestic abuse. But nothing had prepared him for this. The room felt heavier now, the air thicker. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something older, something sinister. "Who's waiting?" Blake asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Madison looked up at him, her eyes full of something Blake couldn't quite place. Was it wisdom? Fear? Desperation? She opened her mouth to speak, but before the words could escape, there was another sound from deep within the house, another cry. This time it was louder, more desperate. Without thinking, Blake rushed down the hallway, ignoring Madison's pleas. He couldn't leave her sister here, not when he was so close. But as he moved, a growing sense of dread began to crawl up his spine. The shadows in the house seemed to twist, moving with a life of their own. Madison followed him closely, her footsteps light but purposeful. "Please, Blake, you don't know what you're walking into," she begged. Blake reached a door at the end of the hallway, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. What he saw inside was enough to freeze his blood. Lily's body lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and eyes closed. She was dressed in a simple nightgown, her small form curled in an unnatural position. The air around her was suffocating, thick with the unmistakable scent of decay and blood. Blake's heart stopped. He dropped to his knees beside her, checking for a pulse. For a moment, he felt nothing, the silence of the room overwhelming him. Then he found it, a faint, fragile pulse, but it was there. Lily was alive. Madison stepped forward cautiously, her face blank. "She's not gone," she said quietly, her voice flat, as though she had expected this outcome. "But she won't wake up, not unless..." "Not unless what?" Blake asked urgently, looking at her, his mind racing. "Not unless you let her come back." Madison answered, her voice dropping to a whisper. Blake's mind spun. He looked back at Lily, then at Madison, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. "Let her come back?" he repeated. "What are you talking about, Madison?" Madison's gaze shifted from Lily's lifeless form to Blake. Her eyes were haunted, now filled with an ancient sorrow. "You don't know, do you? You don't know what she's been through." Blake shook his head, trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. "Tell me, please, what happened to her? What is this place?" Madison didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly over to the window, her small frame casting a long shadow across the room. She stood there for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "There's a curse here," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the silence. "A curse that follows our family. It's been passed down for generations." Blake stared at her, his breath shallow. He had been prepared for many things: drugs, gangs, criminal enterprises. But this was something entirely different. A curse? Blake echoed. "Are you saying your family, your mother?" Madison nodded, her face grim. "Yes, my mom. She didn't want us to know. But it's why Lily is gone. It's why she can't come back unless..." "Unless what?" Blake demanded, his patience wearing thin. "Tell me what's going on, Madison." Madison turned to face him fully, her expression eerily calm. "Unless you let them take her. Unless you let them finish what they started." Blake's eyes widened in disbelief. "You mean, you want me to let them take her? Are you out of your mind?" Madison's voice dropped lower, her words barely audible. "You don't understand, Blake. They already have her. They've always had her. You can't save her unless you give them what they want." Blake stumbled back, his mind reeling. This was beyond anything he had ever faced. There was no explanation he could find that made sense of the madness unfolding before him. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening here, it was not just a simple kidnapping. This was something far older, darker, and far more dangerous. A low growl echoed from the shadows behind him. Blake turned swiftly, but before he could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The room was locked, sealed. Panic began to rise in his chest as he realized they were trapped. He spun back to Madison, only to find her standing there, her eyes hollow, as if she had already accepted what was coming. Blake's heart raced as he shouted, "Madison, we need to get out of here, now!" But Madison didn't move. She was staring at something behind him, her lips trembling as if she were seeing something Blake couldn't. The growl grew louder, closer, and then, out of the darkness came the whisper Blake would never forget. "Join us." Blake's breath caught in his throat. The voice that came from the shadows was cold, ancient, and impossibly calm. It echoed through the room, reverberating against the walls as if the very house itself had spoken. "Join us." He spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. Nothing but darkness and the oppressive silence of the room. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly afraid. Madison stood motionless in the corner of the room, her eyes wide but distant, as if she were hearing something Blake couldn't. Her lips barely moved when she spoke again, but her voice was clear, filled with a sorrow that sent chills down his spine. "They want you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They want all of us." Blake's hands trembled as he reached for his gun, his instincts telling him to prepare for something, anything, that could explain the horror unfolding in front of him. But before he could draw it, another growl echoed from the shadows. This time closer, so close that it felt as though it were breathing on his neck. The hairs on his skin stood on end, and the air in the room thickened, pressing down on him with an oppressive weight. "Madison," Blake said urgently, his voice cracking. With fear, "We need to get out of here now," but she didn't move. Instead, her gaze was fixed on something in the corner of the room, something Blake couldn't see. His eyes darted back and forth, searching, but there was no visible threat. Only the darkness. "The curse," Madison said, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to herself. "It's in the walls, it's in the air, it's been waiting for so long." Blake's mind raced. He had heard whispers of things, stories of ancient cults, family secrets, things too horrific to believe. But nothing like this. He had dealt with serial killers, drug cartels, and gang wars. But this? This was something beyond human comprehension. "Madison," Blake said, grabbing her by the shoulders, trying to shake her from her trance. "Listen to me, we're getting out of here, do you hear me?" Her eyes finally met his, but there was no recognition in them, only an emptiness that shook him to his core. "I can't leave," she said softly. "I've been waiting for this." Blake's grip tightened on her shoulders as he tried to pull her away from the corner, away from whatever was drawing her in. "What are you talking about? We need to—" "Leave, Madison. This is not a game." But her face remained expressionless, her gaze fixed on the same empty corner. The room seemed to pulse with an unseen presence, a dark energy that pressed against Blake's chest. He felt the temperature drop, his breath turning to mist in the air. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed open with an unholy force, and Blake was thrown back against the wall by an invisible force. He gasped for breath, his body aching from the impact. His mind spun as he tried to regain his bearings, and then, in the doorway, a figure appeared, tall, shadowed, and impossibly still. It was not a person, not in the traditional sense. The figure had no face, no form, only a vague silhouette that seemed to warp and bend with the darkness itself. Its presence was suffocating, as though the very air around it had been swallowed. "Hole, join us," the figure whispered again, the words reverberating in Blake's mind. It was not a voice, but something deeper, something that felt like it was inside him, inside his very thoughts. Blake's pulse raced, but his feet felt like they were stuck in cement. He could feel the weight of the figure's presence in every part of his being, a force that made him question everything he knew about reality. His instincts screamed for him to run, to fight, to do anything, but his body wouldn't obey. And then the figure stepped forward. In the blink of an eye, it was standing in front of him, its form shifting and contorting, as if it were not quite bound to this world. Blake tried to move, tried to raise his gun, but his arms wouldn't respond. He felt a coldness creeping into his chest, a darkness that threatened to pull him under. "Let go," the figure whispered, its voice 1,000 winds echoing through his mind. "You cannot fight us, you never could." Blake felt his heart pound in his chest as everything he had ever believed, everything he had ever known, began to unravel. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness pressed against him, suffocating him, pulling him into its depths. But just as it felt like the shadows would swallow him whole, Madison's voice cut through the darkness. "No, he's not one of them." The figure paused, its form shifting uncertainly. Blake's body trembled, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was he losing his mind? Madison stepped forward, her small form standing against the impossible presence of the figure. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were fierce, filled with a resolve that Blake had not seen before. "You're wrong," Madison said firmly, her voice ringing with an authority that didn't belong to a child. "Blake is not one of you." The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It let out a sound, almost like a hiss, before retreating into the shadows. The room seemed to breathe again, the suffocating weight lifting. For a moment, Blake stumbled back to his feet, his heart still racing. He turned to Madison, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What was that? What is happening?" Madison looked at him, her expression unreadable. "They're everywhere, Blake. They've always been. And now they want us all." Blake's mind spun as he tried to grasp the reality of what she was saying. This was no longer just about a missing child. This was something deeper, something rooted in ancient darkness, a force that had been lying in wait for generations. "What do we do now?" Blake asked, his voice hoarse. Madison stepped forward, her gaze steady. "We find the truth. We end it. Before it ends us." Blake looked at her, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what he had walked into, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in this now, and he wouldn't stop until he had answers. As the shadows in the room seemed to shift, Blake knew they had only just begun to scratch the surface of the nightmare that awaited them. Blake could still feel the coldness of the room pressing against him as Madison stood before him, unwavering. The oppressive atmosphere that had nearly choked him just moments ago seemed to dissipate, but the dread in the pit of his stomach remained. He needed answers, and fast. The air still carried an unnatural stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He looked at Madison, whose once innocent eyes now held the weight of centuries. Despite her young age, it was clear she was no ordinary child. Her gaze had shifted from fear to something darker, something far beyond her years. "Madison," Blake started, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What did you mean by they?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides, as if she were bracing herself against something. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They are the ones who've been watching. They've always been here, in this house." "In my family," Madison said, her voice distant. "I've been running from them my whole life. Lily was just another pawn in their game." Blake's mind raced. What could a child possibly mean by that? He had been a detective for over a decade, but nothing, not a single case, had ever prepared him for this. This wasn't just about a missing child. It was something far older, far more sinister. "The curse," Madison continued, "is what keeps them here. It's why Lily is different. Why she can't be saved unless... What?" Blake asked, his frustration growing. He needed to understand. He couldn't keep wandering through this nightmare without a clearer sense of what he was facing. Madison paused, looking up at him with a sorrowful expression. "Unless you let them take her," she said softly. "Unless you allow the curse to be completed." Blake stared at her, his mind trying to process the words. Let them take her? This was madness. He couldn't allow that. He couldn't allow this curse to consume Lily, or Madison, or anyone else. "I'm not letting anyone take her," Blake said firmly, his jaw clenched. "We'll find another way." Madison's face darkened, and her eyes seemed to shimmer with the weight of ancient knowledge. "You don't understand. The curse can't be broken unless they get what they want. And if you fight them, if you resist, they'll take everyone." Blake finished for her, his voice low. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far too terrifying to comprehend. Madison nodded. "They will take everyone. And once they do, they will move on to the next house, the next family." Blake ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. His mind was a blur of thoughts and questions. There had to be another way. He had dealt with impossible cases before, but this felt like a battle against something beyond the natural world. "There has to be another way," Blake repeated, as if saying the words would somehow make them true. "We can stop them without sacrificing." "Lily," Madison's expression softened for a brief moment, as though she were considering his words. But then, her face hardened again, and she shook her head. "You can't stop them, Blake. I've tried. My mother tried. Every generation of my family tried," she said, her voice laced with sorrow. "The curse is unbreakable." Blake couldn't believe what he was hearing. He wasn't willing to accept defeat. Not yet. Not when Lily's life, his own life, was on the line. "We'll find another way," he repeated with more conviction, though deep down, he wasn't sure how. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by a strange creaking noise that sent a jolt of fear through Blake. It sounded like the floorboards groaning beneath an unseen weight, as if something or someone was approaching. Madison looked toward the door, her face draining of color. "They're coming," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "It's too late." Blake turned to face the door, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The air seemed to shift, the darkness in the room thickening. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't alone anymore. With a slow, deliberate step, Blake moved toward the door, his senses on high alert. He couldn't allow whatever was outside to reach them. But as he reached for the doorknob, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and a wave of terror washed over him, freezing him in place. "Don't open it," Madison said, her voice trembling now. "It's them." Blake hesitated. For a brief moment he considered pulling back, but the need to protect Lily, to solve this mystery, pushed him forward. He didn't know what was waiting behind that door, but he couldn't back down now. He turned the knob and threw open the door. What lay beyond was more terrifying than Blake could ever have imagined. Blake's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at what stood in front of him. The dark hallway beyond the door had transformed. It wasn't just a hallway anymore. It was a twisted, living thing, stretching and warping like something from a nightmare. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and Blake could hear faint whispers coming from all around him. Their voices overlapping and indistinguishable, creating an eerie symphony of desperation. Lily's cries echoed from somewhere deep within the distorted hallway, pulling Blake forward like an invisible force. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing against him, the darkness clawing at his skin, threatening to drag him into its depths. "Blake, don't!" Madison's voice cracked behind him, filled with panic. "You don't understand. You can't go in there. It's a trap." But Blake was already moving, stepping into the hallway, his body trembling but driven by a single goal: to find Lily and end whatever curse had bound her. "I'm not leaving her here," Blake said, more to himself than to Madison. He wasn't going to let this nightmare claim any more lives, not without a fight. He took another step forward, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The room went dark, and Blake's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. A shadow loomed ahead, growing larger with each step Blake took. His gun was in his hand, but it felt useless against the overwhelming force that filled the space. The shadow took form, twisting into something more corporeal, more dangerous. It was a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "You should have left when you had the chance," the figure said, its voice low and rasping. It stepped closer, its presence cold and suffocating. Blake's hands tightened around his gun, but his legs felt heavy, as though the very air around him was draining his strength. The figure reached out, its hand elongated and skeletal, and Blake could feel an unbearable pressure building in his chest. "You've entered our domain," the figure hissed, "and now you will never leave." Blake's vision began to blur, his body fighting against the crushing weight of the curse. But even in his weakening state, a spark of defiance remained. He wasn't going down without a fight. Not while Lily, no, not while any of them were trapped in this nightmare. "I will leave," Blake gritted through clenched teeth, "and I'll bring her with me." The figure laughed, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and the darkness seemed to surge in response. "You're too late, detective. She's already ours." Blake felt his breath catch, his thoughts racing. He had to do something. He had to find a way out of this twisted place before it consumed them all. The figure moved closer, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for something, anything to hold on to. But then, in the distance, a light flickered. Faint at first, but growing stronger. A beacon of hope, or the first sign of their final descent. The flickering light in the distance grew brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. Blake's eyes strained to focus on it, his mind foggy and weak from the overwhelming presence of the figure that loomed in front of him. It was as if the light itself was calling him, offering some form of salvation. But there was no time to hesitate. He couldn't afford to lose his grip now. The figure before him, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally, let out another low, guttural laugh. Its hollow eyes glowed, burning with malice, as if mocking his every move. Blake gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the gun, but it felt useless in the face of this nightmare. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, suffocating him. The whispers were louder, now pressing against his skull like 1,000 voices demanding to be heard. "You can't fight what has always been, detective," the figure whispered, its voice dripping with venom. "You don't even understand what you're up against." Blake's head felt light, the pressure on his chest growing with each passing second. He felt like he was suffocating in the very air around him, but still he refused to give in. This was a fight he had to win, for Lily, for Madison, and for everyone else caught in this horrific web. "Let her go," Blake spat, his voice hoarse. "Whatever you are, whatever this is, you won't take her, I won't let you." The figure's hollow eyes flickered with something akin to amusement. It leaned in closer, its cold breath chilling Blake to his core. "She's already ours. You can't save her. You never could." Blake's mind raced. He couldn't let this thing win. He couldn't let it take Madison or Lily or anyone else, but something inside him, some primal instinct, told him he had one. Chance. He turned toward the light, the only thing that seemed like a way out of this nightmare. It was faint at first, but as Blake moved toward it, the light grew brighter, cutting through the oppressive darkness. He stumbled forward, his feet heavy as if wading through thick mud, but his resolve never faltered. He had to reach that light. He had to fight through the fear, the pain, the whispers. Behind him the figure began to scream, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls, shaking the ground beneath him. "You cannot escape! You cannot escape us!" Blake's pulse quickened as he pushed forward, determined to make it to the source of the light. His legs burned with the effort, his body screaming in protest, but he could feel the light pulling him, urging him forward. Every step was a battle, but he refused to let go. He had to do this for Lily, for Madison, for the truth. As he finally reached the light, a sharp pain shot through his chest. It was as if the darkness was fighting him, trying to drag him back into its cold grip. His vision blurred, his breath shallow. But then, in the distance, he saw something. A figure, a woman standing bathed in light, her face shrouded in shadow. "Help me," Blake gasped, barely able to form the words. "I have to save them." The woman didn't speak, but there was something in her gaze that told Blake everything. She knew what he had to do. She knew what he was up against. Blake stumbled forward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The figure behind him screeched in rage, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. But Blake didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The woman in front of him was his only hope. The moment he reached her, the world around him shifted. The darkness receded, pulling away from him as if it were being torn apart by an unseen force. The whispers faded, leaving only silence in their wake. Blake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The light around him was blinding, but it was comforting, like the warmth of the sun after a long winter. The woman reached down, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cold, but it brought with it a sense of clarity, a momentary peace in the midst of the chaos. "You've made it this far," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But there's still much to be done." Blake's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am the one who has watched, who has waited," she replied. "I am the key to ending this." Blake's confusion deepened. "Ending what?" "The curse," the woman said simply. "It is not a force that can be defeated by strength alone. It must be understood. It must be faced. Only then can it be broken." Blake's heart sank. He wasn't sure he understood what she meant, but there was no time to ask more questions. He had to act. He had to find Lily, and he had to stop this nightmare once and for all. The woman's gaze softened. "Your fight has only just begun. The curse runs deeper than you realize, and the one you seek is not the one you think." "What do you mean?" Blake asked urgently. "Lily." She paused, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Lily is not the key. She is the sacrifice." Blake froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the stomach. "No, no, that can't be." "I'm afraid it is," the woman interrupted gently. "But there is still hope. You must find the truth behind the curse. It lies within the walls, in the very foundation of this house. You must go deeper, Blake, and when you do, you will find what you need to stop it." Blake's mind reeled with the new information, but he couldn't afford to waste time. He had to act now. The woman stepped back, fading into the light as if she were never there to begin with. "Go now," she whispered. "The choice is yours, but know this. There will be a price." Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood, his mind racing. The woman's words echoed in his head. Lily wasn't the key. She was the sacrifice. But there had to be another way. He wouldn't let this nightmare end in death. He turned back toward the shadows, a new sense of resolve burning in his chest. He didn't know what he was about to face, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stop now. Lily needed him. And so did Madison. Blake's heart raced as he stepped deeper into the shadows. The woman's words still echoed in his mind. Lily wasn't the key, she was the sacrifice. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he couldn't let it be true. He couldn't let this nightmare end with a child's life. His body was still trembling from the encounter, the pressure of the curse seeming to seep into every fiber of his being, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost. The room he entered was colder than the rest, the walls thick with dust and age. The air here felt wrong, heavier somehow. Blake's eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any clues, anything that would explain what was happening. His eyes fell on an old bookcase, its shelves laden with worn, yellowed books, most of them in poor condition. Something about the sight of them made his skin crawl. But then something caught his attention. A small, cracked mirror in the corner. For the room, it was odd, out of place almost. Blake moved toward it, each step slow, cautious. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the glass. A chill shot through his body. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. For a split second he saw Lily's face, pale, frightened, and bloodshot, her eyes wide with terror. And then, just as quickly, the reflection was gone, replaced by his own confused and stunned expression. Blake's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if that had been a hallucination or something more, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. Lily's cries were faint, but they still echoed through the house. They were no longer coming from one direction. Now they seemed to be everywhere, like whispers floating through the walls. Blake's every instinct told him to follow those cries, to run to her and save her. But the voice of the woman, the mysterious figure who had appeared in the light, warned him to go deeper, to understand the truth before it was too late. With one last look at the mirror, Blake turned away and approached the far side of the room. A wooden trapdoor was partially hidden beneath a rug, its edges old and worn, blending seamlessly with the floor. He knelt and tugged at it, and it creaked open with an eerie groan. His hand hesitated above the opening. Something deep inside him screamed to stop, to turn back, but he ignored it. There was no turning back now. He had to know what lay beneath. He took a deep breath and descended into the darkness. The stairs creaked under his weight, their age and decay threatening to give way with every step he took. The air grew thicker as he descended, and the faint cries of Lily became more distinct. They were coming from somewhere deeper. He pushed forward, his mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. He had no idea what he would find down here, but there was no turning back. At the bottom of the stairs, Blake found himself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old trinkets, jars, and strange objects Blake couldn't quite identify. At the center of the room, however, was an altar, a stone slab covered in dark stains, its surface worn and chipped from years of use. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through Blake's chest. This was the heart of the curse, he was certain of it. The room was suffused with a heavy, oppressive energy. The darkness in this room felt alive, like something ancient and malevolent was watching him from the shadows. Blake stepped closer to the altar, his gaze fixed on the strange symbols etched into the stone. They were unfamiliar, but they had an unsettling familiarity about them. His fingers traced the cold stone as he searched for something, anything that would explain what was happening in this house. That's when he saw it. A book, open on a small wooden pedestal next to the altar. The pages were yellowed and brittle. The ink faded but still legible. Blake reached for it cautiously, afraid of disturbing the fragile pages, but something drew him to it, an invisible pull. He opened the book slowly, the pages creaking with each turn. The words were written in an ancient script that he couldn't understand, but there were diagrams and sketches, images of the same symbols on the altar, as well as detailed drawings of rituals and sacrifices. As his fingers skimmed the pages, one particular passage caught his eye. It spoke of the curse that had been passed down through generations of Madison's family. It was no mere legend. It was a dark, binding force that sought to consume. It mentioned a ritual, one that required a child to be sacrificed, to maintain the balance and power that had kept the curse alive for centuries. Blake's stomach turned as he read further. The curse could only be broken by an ultimate sacrifice, the life of the youngest child in the bloodline. And, according to the book, that child had already been chosen. Lily. Blake's breath caught in his throat as the weight of the truth settled on him like a ton of bricks. Madison had been right. The curse couldn't be defeated by strength or will alone. It required a sacrifice. The ritual had already begun, and Lily had been chosen. Blake slammed the book shut, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. But as the book fell to the ground with a thud, the room seemed to pulse. The walls began to close in, the darkness thickening, suffocating him. The whispers returned, louder now, and a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, looming, and impossibly still. It was the same figure that had haunted him earlier, the one who had whispered in his mind. "You've come too far," the figure's voice boomed, shaking the very air. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Blake's pulse quickened. The figure stepped forward, its presence crushing, as if it were the embodiment of the curse itself. It reached out with a skeletal hand, and Blake's body froze, the air around him thick with malevolent energy. "No!" Blake shouted, his voice shaking but defiant. "I won't let you win." The figure's laugh echoed through the room, cold and hollow. "You cannot fight fate, detective. You cannot stop what is already written." The darkness surged, and Blake felt his legs give way beneath him. But as he fell, something shifted inside him. The woman's words came back to him. "There is still hope. You must face the truth." Blake's mind cleared. The truth was right in front of him. The curse wasn't something that could be stopped by force, by violence. It was a force that had to be understood. It had to be confronted. And Blake had to make the ultimate choice. Would he let the curse claim Lily? Or would he do whatever it took to stop it, even if it meant sacrificing something dear to him? The figure was drawing closer, but Blake's resolve had never been stronger. He had to fight. There was still time to save Lily, but the question remained, at what cost? Blake's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the figure's presence, pressing down on him with an almost tangible force. It was no longer just a physical battle. It was a battle of will, of belief. The darkness was suffocating, curling around him like a serpent, trying to swallow him whole. But Blake refused to give in. He staggered to his feet, his mind racing with the horrifying knowledge he had just uncovered. Lily was the key. She was the sacrifice. But Blake couldn't accept that. He had to find a way to break the curse without allowing that to happen. He had to. The figure in front of him tilted its head slightly, its hollow eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of amusement and disdain. It took a step forward, its skeletal hand reaching out toward Blake with an almost cruel slowness. "You still don't understand, do you?" The figure rasped, its voice like the creaking of old wood. "The curse has always been this way. It cannot be broken. You cannot save her. It's too late." Blake's eyes narrowed as he took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be afraid. The woman, the one who had appeared in the light, guiding him, warning him, had told him there was hope. There had to be a way. "I'm not going to let you take her," Blake said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." The figure paused, its grin widening grotesquely, as though it relished the defiance in Blake's words. "What you don't understand, detective, is that this is not your fight to win. It's been decided long ago. This house, this family, and this curse, everything is woven together. You cannot change what is fated." Blake clenched his fists, the darkness around him pushing against his body, threatening to collapse his lungs. But he couldn't. He wouldn't give up now. Lily's life was at stake, and he wouldn't let this thing take her no matter what it took. The figure stepped closer, its presence like ice against Blake's skin. "You think you can fight the darkness?" It sneered. "You think your will can undo centuries of torment? You are nothing more than a fleeting moment in the long history of pain." Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The figure was right about one thing. This wasn't just a fight of strength. It was a battle of wills, a contest of determination. He needed to outsmart it, outlast it. He had to find the root of the curse, the source of its power, and destroy. He turned sharply and ran toward the altar, hoping, praying that something there would provide him with a clue, a way to end this nightmare. The figure let out a low, mocking laugh behind him, but Blake didn't falter. He couldn't afford to. The altar loomed ahead, its surface cold and dark, its grim presence felt even more intensely now. As Blake reached it, his eyes scanned the symbols again, his mind racing to make sense of the chaos. There had to be something, in the ritual, something he could use to his advantage. Suddenly, his gaze fell on something new, something he had missed earlier. At the base of the altar, a small, intricately carved stone was set into the floor. Blake knelt down and examined it carefully. The carving was faint, almost hidden beneath layers of dust and grime, but it was unmistakable, a symbol he recognized from the book. It was the symbol of a key with an eye at its center, surrounded by arcane patterns Blake couldn't decipher at first. His pulse quickened as he touched it, his fingers brushing over the cold surface. A shiver ran down his spine, and for the first time he felt a connection, something connecting him to the history of this house, to Madison's family, and to the curse itself. The moment his fingers made contact with the stone, a low hum filled the room, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the air. The darkness around him seemed to retreat slightly, as if recoiling from the touch. Blake's heart raced. He had triggered something that had been hidden away for centuries. The air thickened again, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was tense, waiting, as though something was about to be revealed. And then, the whispering began. It started faintly, like a soft wind rustling through the trees, but it grew louder, its words clear now. "You have opened the door." Blake's heart skipped a beat. "What door?" he muttered, his voice tight with fear and anticipation. And then, from the shadows, a shape began to take form. A figure stepped into the dim light, but this one was different. It wasn't the malevolent entity that had haunted him before. This one seemed human. The figure was a woman, her face soft and serene, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. She was dressed in a simple, worn gown, her hands clasped in front of her. Blake stood frozen, unable to look away from her, his mind swirling with questions. "I am the last," she said softly, her voice like a breeze. "The last of the line, the keeper of the curse." Blake blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "The keeper of the curse?" he repeated. The woman nodded. "I was chosen, the firstborn, and I am the one who has kept the curse alive, generation after generation." Blake's mind raced. This wasn't just another ghostly apparition. This was something real, something tied to Madison's family, to the bloodline that had been cursed. "For so long, what do you want from me?" Blake asked, his voice low, filled with both fear and resolve. The woman's eyes softened. "I cannot stop what has been set in motion. But you—" She looked at him closely, her expression almost wistful. "You may be able to break it, but only if you understand." Blake felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of her words. What did she mean? Could he really stop the curse, and what would it cost? "The key is the sacrifice," the woman said, her voice trembling. "But there is another way to end it." Blake's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "You must face the source of the curse," the woman continued. "It is hidden within this house. The key lies beneath you, but it will not be easy. You will have to face your own darkest fears, your own regrets, before you can save her. Blake's heart pounded. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but this was beyond what he had ever expected. He had come this far, but now he had to face the truth, the real truth about the curse. It wasn't just about breaking it. It was about understanding it, confronting the darkness at its core, and finding a way to stop it before it claimed any more lives. And in that moment, Blake knew that whatever came next, he couldn't turn. Back he would face whatever horrors awaited him. He had to. Blake's mind swirled with the woman's words, her cryptic message leaving him with more questions than answers. The weight of her gaze lingered, as though she knew he was the one who could either break the curse or become another lost soul, consumed by it. He had no choice now. The path was set before him, and it was a path that led deeper into the house, the very heart of the curse. The figure of the woman who had introduced herself as the keeper of the curse seemed to fade into the dim shadows of the room, her presence leaving an eerie silence in her wake. Blake was left alone, his thoughts racing. He needed to understand the source of this curse, the key that lay beneath him, and most of all, how he could save Lily. But the darkness around him seemed to grow stronger, pulsating like a living thing. His heart hammered in his chest as the house seemed to shift and breathe. Every step he took felt heavy, as though the very foundation of the place was trying to pull him into its depths. He could hear the faint cries of Lily in the distance, but they were distorted now, almost as if they were coming from all directions at once. Blake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. There was no turning back now. He had to face what was buried deep within the heart of this house. He moved toward the stone altar once again, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, their ancient power calling to him. He reached out, his fingers brushing over the cold stone, feeling the hum of energy beneath his touch. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones as if something was awakening. Blake closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation, trying to tap into whatever force was buried within this place. His mind drifted to the woman's words, the key, the sacrifice, the source. Suddenly, a loud creak sounded from the far corner of the room, followed by the sound of scraping metal. Blake spun around, his gun already in hand. The floor beneath him groaned, as if something was stirring from the darkness below. The air grew thick with tension. From the corner of the room, a hatch in the floor slowly began to open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into complete darkness. The cries of Lily grew louder, echoing from deep within the house, spurring Blake to move toward the opening without hesitation. He didn't have time to question it. This was where the truth lay. Blake descended the stairs carefully, the dim light from the room above barely illuminating his way. His heart pounded with every step, the weight of the curse pressing down on him. The darkness seemed to wrap around him, thick and oppressive, but he didn't stop. The cries of Lily were closer now, almost within reach. At the bottom of the stairs, Blake found himself in a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces obscured by years of dust. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the silence was suffocating. Every instinct in Blake's body screamed at him to turn back, but he knew he couldn't. He had come this far. Ahead, a faint light flickered from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. It was a soft, eerie glow, almost like the light from the woman's presence, but colder, more insidious. Blake stepped forward, his hand gripping his gun tighter as he approached the door. When he reached it, he hesitated. He could feel the weight of the decision on him. Behind this door lay the truth, the source of the curse, the power that had held Madison's family captive for generations. And Lily, she was somewhere inside. Blake pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning. In protest, the room inside was unlike anything he had seen before. It was large, circular, and in the center stood a massive stone pillar. At the base of the pillar there was a strange, glowing symbol etched into the stone, identical to the one he had seen earlier, the one on the altar. The symbol seemed to pulse with life as if the curse itself were alive, feeding off the energy in the room, and there, lying on the cold stone floor, was Lily. Blake's heart sank as he rushed toward her, his mind reeling. She was unconscious, her small body limp and pale, but there was no sign of injury. She was alive, but barely. The room seemed to pulse with the same dark energy, as if the curse itself was feeding off her. Blake knelt beside her, his hands trembling, as he checked for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. She was alive, but barely holding on. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, trying to draw him in, to make him part of its darkness. He could hear the whispers again, louder this time, urging him to join them, to let the curse claim him. Blake shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. He couldn't let it take him. He couldn't let it take Lily. There had to be a way to break the cycle. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, and Blake's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his gun raised, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the stone pillar and the strange glowing symbol. And then, the whispers began again, louder this time. They weren't just voices. They were memories. Voices. From the past, from generations of Madison's family. The curse was speaking to him, revealing its secrets. "Break the cycle," a voice whispered, faint but clear. "Break the curse. You must destroy the heart of it. The sacrifice must be made." Blake's pulse raced as he looked down at Lily. His thoughts swirled. The curse demanded a sacrifice. But if he destroyed the heart of it, if he ended it, would that break the cycle? Or would it cost him everything? He looked back at the stone pillar, his mind racing. The key was hidden here, he realized. The symbol, the pillar, everything. The curse had a physical form, and it was tied to this place. He had to destroy it. But the question lingered in his mind. Would he destroy the curse at the cost of Lily's life? The whispers grew louder, urging him forward. Blake's hands clenched into fists. He didn't know what the answer was yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would face the darkness head on. He would break the curse, no matter the cost. The whispers swirled around Blake like a storm, an unrelenting tide of voices from the past, from generations trapped in the curse that had plagued this house and Madison's family for centuries. They told him to break the cycle. They told him the sacrifice must be made. But they never told him how, or what the consequences would be. Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside Lily's frail body, her shallow breaths the only sign of life left in her. Her skin was cold to the touch, and she seemed so small, so vulnerable, lying in the center of the curse's power. It was clear that the curse had drained her, just as it had drained the generations before her. If Blake didn't act, it would claim her completely. His gaze flickered back to the glowing symbol etched into the stone pillar. The energy radiating from it was thick, oppressive, alive, in a way. Blake could feel the weight of it pressing against him, an ancient force that had been growing, waiting for this moment. It was the heart of the curse, and it demanded a sacrifice. But Blake couldn't just give in. He couldn't let the darkness take another innocent life, especially not Lily's. There had to be another way. As Blake's mind raced, he remembered the woman, the keeper of the curse. Her words echoed in his head. "You must face the source of the curse. It lies beneath you, but it will not be easy. You will have to face your own darkest fears, your own regrets, before you can save her." His hands trembled, but Blake steeled himself. This was it. He was at the breaking point, standing at the crossroads of destiny. If he was going to break this curse, if he was going to save Lily, he had to confront the darkness, both within the house and within himself. Taking a deep breath, Blake stood, his resolve hardening. He looked down at Lily once more, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision that lay before him. She was all he had left to save. He couldn't fail her now. The whispers in the room grew louder, urgent, almost frantic. The sacrifice must be made. They echoed again and again, a mantra that felt like it was clawing at his soul. But then Blake remembered something. The key, the symbol on the stone floor. The woman had said that there was another way. He didn't have to give in to the curse. He could find the source, confront it, and destroy it. With newfound determination, Blake turned toward the pillar. The light emanating from the symbol flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows across the room. The darkness seemed to stir, as though it was alive. Sensing that Blake was finally ready to act, Blake approached the stone pillar, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the glowing symbol. The moment his fingers made contact, the entire room seemed to pulse with power. The walls shook, and the temperature dropped dramatically, his breath turning to mist in front of him. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a swarm of bees. They urged him to let go, to surrender to the curse. But Blake fought against it, pushing through the mental and emotional fog, focusing on the task at hand. The curse wasn't just about power. It was about control. The control it had over the family, over Madison, and now over Lily. As Blake pressed his hand deeper into the symbol, a flash of memory hit him, his own darkest fear. His thoughts flashed back to a moment he had buried deep within himself. He had lost his daughter. The pain, the loss, the guilt, it had consumed him, leaving him hollow. For so long he had buried that grief, telling himself he couldn't save her, that he had failed. But now, standing before the curse that had consumed so many, Blake realized that his failure was not the end of his story. It was part of his journey. His loss had shaped him, yes, but it didn't define him. Blake closed his eyes, the memories of his own darkness fading as he took a step forward into the light of the pillar. He let go of the fear, the guilt, the loss, and in its place, something stronger took root. He wasn't the man who had failed before. He was the man who could face the curse and defeat it. The whispers began to scream, growing louder, desperate to break his focus, but Blake's mind was clearer than it had ever been. He wasn't just fighting for Lily now. He was fighting for himself, for the redemption that had eluded him for so long, and he would not let this ancient evil take any more lives. With a final steadying breath, Blake pressed harder on the symbol. The light that had been flickering grew blindingly bright, and the room began to vibrate violently. The air around him crackled with power. Suddenly there was a burst of sound, an explosion of energy shattering the silence that had consumed the room. Blake stumbled back, his hands instinctively covering his eyes as the light engulfed everything. When he finally dared to open them, the room was different. The oppressive weight of the curse had lifted, the shadows retreating back into the walls. The light from the pillar faded, and with it, the energy that had been choking the life out of the house. For the first time, the room felt still, empty, and free. Blake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest, and the exhaustion of the battle with the curse hit him like a wave. But as he looked over at Lily, still, lying motionless on the ground, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. The curse had been broken. The source of it was gone. Blake crawled toward her, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. It was still faint, but it was there. He had done it. He had saved her. But as Blake gently shook Lily's shoulders, trying to rouse her, he felt the weight of what he had just done. The cost of breaking. The curse wasn't just in what had happened within the house. It was in what he had had to face. The darkest parts of his own soul. Lily's eyes fluttered open, her gaze soft and confused. She blinked up at Blake, her small frame trembling. And for a brief moment, Blake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done the impossible. He had saved her. "Blake?" Lily whispered, her voice weak. "Where am I?" Blake smiled through. The tears that welled up in his eyes, his heart swelling with relief. "You're safe now, Lily. You're safe." The whispers, the darkness, and the weight of the curse had finally been vanquished. And with it, Blake knew that he had faced his own demons, the ones he had buried for so long. He had made the right choice. He had chosen to fight, to heal, and to save those who needed him the most. As the light in the room dimmed, Blake held Lily close, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he believed in the possibility of a future free from the curse. The room, once thick with darkness and whispers, now felt hollow. The heavy weight that had suffocated Blake for what seemed like an eternity was gone. In its place was a quiet, almost eerie stillness. Blake still felt the pounding of his heart in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close they had come to losing it all. But now, there was peace. Lily's small, fragile form lay in his arms, her breathing steady and strong. Her eyes, still clouded with confusion, were slowly clearing. The moment of terror and chaos had passed, leaving in its wake the raw reality of what had just happened. Blake had done the unthinkable, broken the curse, and saved her. But there was still so much left to reckon with. Where am I? Lily's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Blake had heard in a long time. Blake looked down at her, his eyes full of tenderness and relief. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe, Lily. You're safe. We're both safe now." Lily blinked, her small hand weakly reaching up to touch Blake's face. The confusion in her eyes slowly turned to recognition. But the house, the shadows, they were so dark. Her voice trailed off as memories of the horrors they'd just faced seemed to flood her mind. Blake took a deep breath, holding her tighter. The weight of everything he had experienced, everything they had fought through, still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. But for the first time, there was hope. It's over now. It's all gone. The light in the room had returned to normal, no longer flickering with an unnatural glow. The eerie whispers that had once filled the air were silenced. It was as though the house, the curse, had never existed. The oppressive energy was gone, but that didn't mean the battle was entirely over. Blake stood slowly, still cradling Lily in his arms, and turned his gaze toward the now dimmed stone pillar. Its eerie glow had faded, leaving only the cold stone, untouched by any sinister force. He didn't know how long they would have until the peace settled fully into their lives, but right now, he had to hold on to this moment, this victory. As he made his way toward the stairs, carrying Lily with him, the quiet of the house seemed almost unnerving. The once oppressive weight was gone, but something was still missing. There was a hollowness to the place, an emptiness that had been filled by fear and malevolent energy for so long. Now, the silence felt more like a question. What would come next? Lily stirred in his arms, her voice still soft and sleepy. "Blake, is it really gone? Is the curse really broken?" Blake smiled down at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "It's gone. I destroyed it. You're safe. You're free now." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were true. The curse that had haunted Madison's family, that had consumed Lily and nearly taken her life, had been broken. Blake had faced the darkness head-on, confronted his own demons in the process, and emerged victorious. Still, as he walked through the now quiet house, something gnawed at him. He hadn't done this alone. Madison's strength, her bravery, her willingness to fight alongside him, those were the things that had kept him going, even when the darkness felt overwhelming. And now, Lily, her life, her future, was what had driven him to push through every obstacle. Blake finally reached the doorway of the house. The sun, which had been hidden behind the storm clouds during their journey, now shone brightly through the windows. The morning light bathed the house in a new warmth, casting away the last traces of the darkness. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked into the sunlight, carrying Lily. The world felt different now, lighter, more vibrant. The air smelled fresh, free of the musty scent of decay that had once filled the house. And though Blake had no idea what came next, for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. Lily's voice, quiet but insistent, broke through his thoughts. "Blake, are we going to be okay now?" Blake looked down at her small face still holding the traces of the trauma she'd experienced. But there was a softness there now, a tentative hope. "Yes, Lily, we're going to be okay." He didn't know how the future would unfold, but in that moment, The weight of his past failures and his doubts seemed to lift. The house, the curse, the nightmare, they were behind them now. And as he gazed out into the distance, a sense of peace finally began to settle within him. The fight was over. They had won. Lily stirred again, her eyes fluttering open fully now, her confusion replaced with a quiet understanding. She looked up at Blake and whispered, "Thank you. I'm not scared anymore." Blake smiled softly, his heart full. He gently kissed the top of her head, knowing that their journey was far from over, but this moment, this victory, belonged to them. They had fought together, and they had survived. And for the first time in a long while, Blake believed that healing was possible. The air felt crisp and refreshing, almost like a rebirth. The sunlight, once hidden behind thick clouds, now poured into the world in vibrant beams, casting everything it touched in a golden glow. For the first time in what felt like forever, Blake could breathe deeply without the weight of a curse hanging over his shoulders. He walked slowly through the yard, holding Lily close to him. She was small, fragile in his arms, but she was alive. She was free. The horrors that had nearly consumed them both were behind them. But Blake knew this moment was only the beginning. The curse had been broken, but the wounds it left behind would take time to heal. Lily shifted in his arms, her eyes heavy with sleep but still wide with curiosity. Her gaze lifted to the sky, the light making her eyes glisten. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost in awe. "It feels different." Blake smiled, his heart swelling with both pride and relief. "It is, Lily. It's the beginning of something new, a new life for both of us." Lily's gaze lingered on the sky for a few more moments, and then she turned back to Blake, her expression soft. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with the weight of the question. Blake stopped walking and stood there for a moment, looking at her. He wasn't sure what the future would look like. He couldn't see it clearly yet. But for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty wasn't a burden. It was a possibility. "I think we take it one step at a time," Blake said gently. "We find our way forward, together." The road ahead wasn't clear. There were still questions, still pieces of the puzzle that hadn't fully come together. He knew that Madison's family would need help in rebuilding after everything that had happened. And Blake, he still had his own demons to face. The loss of his daughter, the guilt that had plagued him for so long, the emotional scars that ran deeper than he had allowed himself to admit. But for now, he was here. And Lily was here. That was enough. They continued to walk, Blake's hand, never leaving her back as they made their way out of the yard and into the quiet town. The silence that had once been heavy and suffocating now felt like a blessing. It was a peace that had been hard-earned. As they walked, Blake couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the world around him. The houses on the street that had once seemed dreary now appeared brighter, filled with life. The air felt cleaner, as though the curse had polluted not only the house but the very fabric of the town. And now, with that evil finally lifted, the world felt open to possibilities again. They passed by the small cafe where Blake had often come to drink his coffee, a place where he had spent countless mornings lost in thought. It had always been a simple, quiet spot, until today. Today, as he looked at it, he saw it as a symbol of renewal. He didn't know what the future held, but he could see a way forward, and that alone made the world seem less daunting. "Blake," Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Do you think people will be okay now? Will they be safe?" Blake stopped and knelt down so he was at eye level with her. Her eyes, though filled with innocence, held a weight far beyond her years. She had faced things no child should have to face, and yet here she was, still standing, still asking the questions that mattered most. "They will be safe now, Lily," Blake said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "The curse is broken, and I won't let anything hurt you again." Lily gave him a small, tentative smile, and for the first time, Blake saw the flicker of hope in her eyes that had been absent for so long. The weight of her fear had lifted, and it was as if she were reclaiming a part of herself that had been stolen away. As they continued their walk, Blake's thoughts began to shift toward the future. There was so much healing to be done, not just for Lily but for him as well. But as he looked at her, walking beside him in the light of a new day, Blake knew that together they would make it through. This wasn't the end of their journey. It was a new beginning. They reached the small park at the center of town where children were playing and the sounds of laughter filled the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, Blake felt at peace. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Blake knelt down once more, setting Lily gently on the grass. She stood, brushing off her clothes, her gaze still filled with wonder as she looked up at the sky. There was something beautiful in her expression, a childlike wonder that Blake hadn't seen in her for so long. And in that moment, he realized that there was more to life than the pain and darkness they had faced. There was light, there was hope, and there was a chance for a future, one that Blake would fight for no matter what. "I think," Blake said with a smile, "that it's time to let go of the past and start living. Let's make sure that we always remember this moment, the moment we broke free." Lily turned to him and nodded. "We will, Blake, we will." And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Blake knew that no matter what came next, they would face it with courage. Together, the world was wide open now. It was theirs to shape, to rebuild, to heal, and the future, though uncertain, was full of promise. The peaceful silence that had descended on Blake and Lily felt like the calm before a storm. The house, the curse, the darkness, it was all behind them now. But as Blake and Lily walked through the town, taking in the familiar sights that now seemed somehow different, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes of the past weren't fully gone. As they continued down the street, Blake noticed how everything seemed clearer, brighter, more vibrant than before. The world had been muted for so long, trapped in a cycle of darkness and fear. But now the sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm, golden light over everything it touched. But the weight of his past still lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. Lily had been freed from the curse, but Blake had his own battle to fight. The guilt, the mistakes, and the loss. He couldn't ignore them, no matter how much he wanted to. "Blake," Lily's soft voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back into the present. She was holding his hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his, but there was a certain hesitation in her touch. It was as if she could feel the distance between them, the things Blake wasn't saying. "Are you okay?" Blake stopped walking and looked down at her. Her face, still fragile from everything she had been through, looked up at him with a mix of concern and care. She had been through so much, yet here she was, still asking about him. "I'm fine, Lily," Blake replied, though his voice faltered slightly. He wasn't fine. Not really. He had faced down the curse, fought for Lily's life, but he hadn't yet faced his own ghosts. "Just thinking." Lily didn't say anything, but she squeezed his hand tighter. Blake smiled softly, appreciating her unspoken understanding. She had always been the brave one, even when she had every reason to be afraid. They continued walking, eventually finding themselves at the small cafe where Blake had spent countless mornings, sipping coffee and reflecting on his life. It had always been a place of quiet, of solitude, but today, it felt different. As they entered, the barista greeted them with a warm smile, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Blake chose a small table by the window, his eyes scanning the room as he settled into the chair. The cafe had always been his retreat, a place to sort through his thoughts. But now, as he sat there with Lily, he realized how much had changed. The walls no longer felt like a prison. The silence that had once pressed down on him, reminding him of the choices he had made, was now simply quiet. And that was okay. He could breathe without feeling suffocated. But he still didn't know how to move forward, how to let go of the past that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. Lily had been through so much, but now she seemed at peace. Her eyes were brighter than before, her small smile more genuine. She had been through hell and back, but here she was, trying to make sense of the world. It was a light that Blake couldn't help but admire. "Blake," Lily's voice broke through his thoughts again. She was staring at him, her gaze steady. You don't have to be sad. We're safe now. We're free. Blake looked at her, his heart tightening. I know, he said quietly. I have a lot to think about. Like what? Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Lily. I've spent so much of my life trying to fix things, trying to make up for all the things I've done wrong. But sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, the past is always there. Lily was quiet for a moment, her eyes not leaving his face. She seemed to be weighing his words, processing them in a way that only a child could. After a long pause, she said, But the past doesn't get to tell us what happens next. We do. Blake blinked, taken aback by her words. There was so much wisdom in her voice, wisdom that she shouldn't have had to learn at such a young age. It was as if the darkness they had faced together had shaped her into someone who saw the world clearly, without the filters of fear and doubt that so often clouded adult minds. You're right, Blake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He cleared his throat and gave her a small smile. You're very wise for someone so young. Lily smiled back, her eyes sparkling. I learned from the best. Blake chuckled softly, his heart lightening just a little. She was right. They had both learned from each other, and that was the beginning of something new. Together they had faced the impossible and come out on the other side stronger. There was no way to change the past, but they had the power to shape the future. The barista brought over their coffees, setting them down on the table with a friendly nod. Blake stared into his cup, the steam rising in gentle curls, but his thoughts were clearer now. The curse was broken. Lily was safe. And while there was still work to do, he still had his own healing to face. He knew now that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. I guess this is the part where we start over, huh? Blake said, his voice light but thoughtful. Lily nodded, her face breaking into a grin. Yep, a whole new start. Blake took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth. The world was wide open before them. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that, for now, was enough. As they sat there, sipping their drinks and watching the world outside, Blake felt a shift deep within him. It wasn't a sudden dramatic change, but a quiet understanding that he could no longer let the weight of the past hold him back. The future was unwritten, and it was time to write it. They had faced the darkness together. Now, it was time to step into the light. Blake sat in the cafe, his eyes lingering on Lily as she stirred her cup absent-mindedly. Her eyes had a quiet kind of wonder now, the kind that only a child could possess after surviving something so unfathomable. Blake watched her, still in awe that she was here, alive and slowly healing from the darkness that had tried to consume her. The cafe was bustling with the usual hum of voices, but the noise felt distant, almost comforting. Outside, the town had resumed its daily rhythm, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just days ago. The storm had passed, but the road ahead still seemed uncertain. Blake took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. He had fought the curse, faced the shadows of his past, and emerged victorious. But what now? What did it mean to live in a world where everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down? Blake? Lily's voice broke through his reverie, and he turned to look at her. She was watching him closely, as if trying to understand his thoughts. The way she had become so attuned to his moods, the way she could sense when something was off. It reminded him of just how much they had been through together. What is it, sweetheart? Blake asked gently. Lily bit her lip, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her cup. What happens now? I mean, after everything. Are we really okay? Blake studied her face, the vulnerability still present, though not as heavy as it had been when she was trapped in the curse. He knew what she was asking. What did it mean to be okay after all they had survived? We're okay now, Blake said, his voice steady. But that doesn't mean everything's magically fixed. We're both going to need time to heal, physically, emotionally, but we have a chance to start over, to move forward. Lily nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. But what if we mess up again? Blake felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of the mistakes he'd made, of the things he couldn't undo. But he knew that Lily didn't need answers, not right now. She needed reassurance. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But together, they could face whatever came next. We might mess up, Blake admitted, his eyes meeting hers with a soft sincerity. But the important thing is that we keep trying. We've been through a lot, and we've learned a lot. You're not alone in this, and neither am I. Lily's small smile was quiet, but it was real. I think I can live with that. Blake reached across the table, gently taking her hand. Her touch, small and soft, was grounding, as if reminding him that despite the uncertainty, they had each other. And that was more than enough. The cafe's door opened, and the light from outside spilled in, washing the room in a fresh golden hue. Blake turned his head, just catching sight of a familiar figure walking through the door. It was Jonathan, his former partner, the one who had been with him through thick and thin, who had seen the darker sides of Blake's life, and who had always had his back. Jonathan spotted Blake immediately, his tired eyes softening when he saw him sitting with Lily. Without a word, he made his way over to their table. "Blake, I didn't expect to find you here," Jonathan said, his voice rough but friendly. He offered a tired smile before glancing at Lily. "How's she doing?" Blake met his gaze, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between them. Jonathan had been there during the investigation, had been a part of the turmoil surrounding Lily's disappearance and the strange events of the curse. Now he stood before Blake, his presence a reminder of the complexities of their shared past. "She's better," Blake replied. "We're both better." Jonathan's expression softened. "I'm glad to hear that." He hesitated before taking a seat at the table. "You know, I never did get the full story. You've been through a lot, but I can't help but wonder what happens now." Blake glanced at Lily before turning his focus back to Jonathan. There was no easy answer. The road ahead wasn't going to be simple, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to face it alone. "I don't know yet," Blake said finally. "But I know that we need to rebuild. We need to figure out how to heal and move forward, not just for us, but for everyone affected by this. The people who were hurt by the curse, the people who had no idea what was going on. We all need to find a way to start over." Jonathan nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You've always been about justice, Blake, but I think this time it's about something more. It's about living with what's happened and finding a way to make it right." Blake was quiet for a moment, contemplating Jonathan's words. He had spent so many years running from the past, from his mistakes. But now the past wasn't something he could outrun. He had to face it, embrace it, and learn from it. He had to accept that mistakes were part of life, part of growth. "I think you're right," Blake said, his voice low but steady. "It's about finding a way to make things right. Not just for Lily and me, but for everyone. We all have to face the consequences of what happened. But we also have to give ourselves the chance to heal. We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure it never happens again." Jonathan gave a slight nod, as if he understood what Blake was saying. He hadn't just come to check on them. He had come because he wanted to be a part of their recovery too. "I'll help," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes, I'll help. You don't have to do this alone." Blake looked at Jonathan, a faint sense of relief washing over him. For so long, he had shouldered the weight of everything, feeling like it was his burden to bear. But now there was a sense of shared purpose. He wasn't alone in this. "Thanks, Jonathan," Blake said quietly. "I think we're going to need all the help we can get." Lily looked between the two men, sensing the shift in the room, the unspoken promise of support. She smiled, her face softening in that quiet way that seemed to define her now. "Together," she said simply, the word carrying weight far beyond her years. Blake smiled, his heart full. He knew they had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time he felt hopeful. They had faced the darkness together. Now it was time to build something better. As the sun continued to set outside the window, casting the cafe in a warm, golden light, Blake knew that, for the first time in a long while, the future was in their hands. The road ahead was theirs to walk, and they would walk it together. The days that followed were a blur of new beginnings. Blake found himself slowly shedding the weight of the past, though the process wasn't as clean and smooth as he'd hoped. It was like peeling away layers from an old wound, each layer revealing something deeper, something rawer. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in that process. Lily, Jonathan, and even Madison, in her quiet way, were part of the rebuilding. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when the fear would come rushing back, threatening to swallow them whole. But there were also glimmers of light, small moments of peace, of laughter, of healing. Blake had learned to take those moments, to savor them. For so long he had been consumed by the darkness, by the weight of his past mistakes. But now he was choosing to step into the light, to give himself and those around him a chance at something better. The town was slowly recovering too. The curse that had hung over it like a shadow had finally lifted. The people who had been unknowingly affected by the dark force that had taken root in their community were beginning to rebuild as well. And though the scars would never fully disappear, there was a shared sense of resilience in the air. It was as if the entire town had collectively exhaled, releasing the breath they'd been holding for so long. One evening, as Blake and Lily walked through the park, the world seemed still and peaceful. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a soft golden hue. The air was warm and there was a crispness to it, a hint of change. Blake could feel it in the air. The world was shifting. The darkness had retreated, and in its place something new was being forged. Lily tugged gently at his sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. "Blake, look." She pointed to a nearby bench where a small group of children were playing, laughing together. The joy on their faces was infectious, and it reminded Blake of everything that had been at stake. It reminded him of why he had fought so hard to break the curse. The future, their future, was worth every battle. "Yeah," Blake said softly, looking at her with a smile. "They're free now, too." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think we are too." Blake's heart skipped a beat. He realized then that Lily wasn't just talking about the curse that had nearly consumed her or the house that had been a prison for so long. She was talking about something bigger, something that they both had to face together. They were both free, not just from the curse, but from the fear, from the shadows of the past that had haunted them. It was a freedom that had to be earned, but one they had both fought for. "Yeah," Blake agreed quietly. "We are." They continued walking, the sounds of children's laughter filling the air around them. Blake felt the weight in his chest lighten just a little. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were living again. And the future, though uncertain, held possibilities. As they walked, Blake felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. Not just for Lily, but for everyone who had been affected by the curse. He had promised to help them rebuild, to make sure that something like this never happened again. And he was going to keep that promise, even if it meant confronting more of his own demons along the way. He had come this far. He wasn't turning back now. Later that evening, Blake found himself at the local diner with Jonathan, the two of them sharing a quiet meal. The din of conversation and clinking silverware around them felt distant, almost surreal. After everything that had happened, after the curse, after the dark forces that had tried to tear their lives apart, it was hard to believe that the world had returned to something so normal. Jonathan took a sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful as he set the cup down. "You've done something remarkable, Blake," he said quietly, his voice low but sincere. "I've been around long enough to know that most people, after going through what you've been through, they don't come back. They break. They fall apart. But you—" He paused, looking over at Blake. "You're still standing, you're still fighting." Blake looked up from his plate, meeting Jonathan's eyes. His words weren't an easy thing to hear, especially when so much of Blake's life had been defined by mistakes, by regrets. But in that moment, he realized Jonathan was right. He had fought, and he wasn't done yet. "I didn't do it alone," Blake said quietly. "I had help. Lily, you, all of us, we fought together." Jonathan nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "True, but you kept pushing forward, even when it seemed impossible." Blake took a deep breath, the weight of his past lingering in the corners of his mind. "I had to, for Lily, for myself. I don't know what's ahead, but I know I've got to make things right, and that starts now." Jonathan's smile widened, and he leaned back in his chair. "I've got your back, Blake. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Blake's chest swelled with gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He still had to deal with the fallout from everything that had happened, the guilt and the grief that weighed him down. But for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. And that meant everything. Later, as they left the diner and stepped into the cool evening air, Blake looked over at Jonathan, the steady presence beside him. "What do you think happens now? For us, for the town?" Jonathan thought for a moment, then shrugged with a grin. "We rebuild. We make sure the darkness stays away, and we do what we can to help the people who've been hurt. It won't be easy, but we've got time. Time to make it right." Blake nodded. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about moving forward. And as long as they kept moving, kept working together, they could rebuild the town, the lives they had once lost, their future. As Blake and Jonathan walked into the night, Blake felt a quiet sense of peace settle in his chest. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he was ready to face it. He had found strength in the people around him, in the relationships he had rebuilt, and in the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in a long while, he could say he was ready for what came next. The days blurred into weeks, and with each passing one, Blake began to settle into his new reality. The weight of the past, while never fully gone, became something he learned to carry. Slowly but surely, the pieces of his life began to fall into place. He had faced the darkest part of himself, confronted the curse that had nearly destroyed him and Lily, and now, as he looked at the world around him, he could see the possibilities. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was one he was willing to walk. Blake stood in the center of the town square, taking in the scene around him. The town, once quiet and unaware of the horrors hiding in its depths, now buzzed with life. There was a vibrancy to it, one that hadn't been there before. The streets were lined with people, many of them familiar faces, smiling and chatting, the sound of children's laughter floating through the air. It was as though the curse had never existed, and in a way, it hadn't. The dark force that had held this place captive for so long was gone, and with it, the fear. But even though the town had moved on, Blake couldn't help but notice the remnants of what had happened. Tiny scars on the landscape, whispers of the past in the eyes of those who had survived. It wasn't something you could just forget. It was something you carried with you, but you learned to live with it. Lily, at his side, seemed to notice the same thing. She had a maturity about her now, one that was almost unsettling. She had witnessed horrors no child should ever have to endure, but it had shaped her into someone strong. Someone who had already begun to heal, though Blake knew it would take time. The process was long, and there would be days where the weight of what she'd gone through would press on her. But they were both learning how to carry it. Blake, "Look!" Lily pointed across the square, where a group of children were playing with a ball. They were laughing, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the heaviness that had once dominated their world. Blake smiled, watching the scene for a moment. It's good to see them happy. Lily's eyes were focused on the group, her small fingers wrapped around his hand tightly. "Do you think we can be happy again too?" Blake's heart tightened. He wanted to say yes with certainty, but the truth was, happiness wasn't something you could just choose. It had to come on its own terms. The past, the trauma, the losses, they didn't just disappear, but they could be overcome. "We are happy, Lily," Blake said quietly, his gaze shifting to meet hers. "It's just a different kind of happiness now, one that we have to build every day." Lily nodded, as if understanding. Her innocence hadn't been lost, but it had evolved into something deeper, something more resilient. As the days passed, Blake continued to help the town recover. He and Jonathan worked together, reaching out to those who had been most affected by the curse, offering what assistance they could. People still had questions, still needed to understand what had happened, and Blake gave them what he could, without revealing too much, without reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. Some things he realized didn't need to be fully understood. Not yet. Madison, too, had started to find her way. She had been changed by the curse, by everything she had lost and gained, but she was finding her voice again, helping to rebuild the ties that had once been torn apart. She was strong, more so than Blake had originally realized, and though the pain of her past would never fully leave her, she too was learning to live with it. One afternoon, Blake found himself back at the old house, the place where so much of the darkness had begun. It had been cleaned, restored in the wake of the curse's destruction. The house now stood as a silent witness to everything that had happened, but it was no longer the ominous, suffocating place it once had been. It had been turned into a center for the community, a place for healing, a place for people to come together and share their stories, their burdens. Blake stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The air was still, calm. It didn't feel like the same house. It felt like something new, a space where people could leave their past behind and look to the future. He ran his fingers along the wall, feeling the rough texture beneath his hand, and he couldn't help but smile. Lily stood beside him, her gaze shifting around the room, taking it all in. "It's different now," she said softly. Blake nodded. "It is." For the first time in what felt like forever, Blake felt a sense of closure, not because everything was perfect, but because they had survived. They had overcome the curse, the darkness, and they had come out on the other side. There would always be scars, but scars didn't mean defeat. They meant survival. As Blake stood there in the silence of the house, he thought back to everything. He had faced the grief, the guilt, the fear, but he also thought of the victories, the small, quiet victories that had come from their struggle. The moments when Lily had laughed again, the moments when he had seen hope in her eyes. Blake had been afraid for so long, afraid of what would happen next. But now, he realized, he didn't have to be afraid anymore. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And for the first time, he was ready to step into that future. The evening air was cool against Blake's skin as he walked through the streets, his mind lost in thought. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but there was a sense of peace in the stillness. The town that had once been overshadowed by fear was now alive with the hum of renewal, and Blake could see it in the faces of the people he passed. There was hope in their eyes. But Blake knew that while the town was healing, he was still in the process of doing so himself. The past was never truly gone. It lingered at the edges of his thoughts, a constant reminder of the things he had lost, the choices he had made, and the guilt that still weighed on him. He had broken the curse, saved Lily, and rebuilt the town's sense of safety. But in some ways, Blake hadn't yet rebuilt himself. He stopped at the edge of the park, watching as the last light of the day faded into the horizon. The shadows stretched long across the grass, and Blake felt a familiar ache in his chest. The sun was setting, marking the end of the day, but it also felt like an end to something else, something deeper. The journey of the past several weeks had been one survival, of living through darkness and emerging on the other side. But Blake wasn't sure where to go from here. "Blake?" The sound of Lily's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to find her standing a few paces away, her small face lit by the golden light of the setting sun. She looked up at him with her wide, hopeful eyes. "Yeah?" Blake said, his voice quieter than usual. Lily hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the park behind her, where the children were still playing. "I think I'm starting to feel better," she said slowly. I think, I think we both are. Blake smiled softly at her words. She was strong, so much stronger than he could have imagined. But he also knew that strength didn't come without its cost. They were both still carrying the weight of what they'd survived. You've been through a lot, kid, Blake said, crouching down so he could meet her eyes. And I'm proud of how far you've come. Lily shrugged, a small, shy smile tugging at her lips. I've had a lot of help, she said. You've been there for me, and so has Jonathan and Madison. Blake's heart tightened at the mention of Madison. She had been through her own struggle, her own battles with the remnants of the curse, but she had fought alongside him to bring this town back from the edge. He had seen the strength in her, but also the hurt that hadn't fully healed, wounds that still needed tending. I know, Blake said quietly. We've all been helping each other, haven't we? Lily nodded. But it's different now. I don't think we need to be scared anymore. Blake swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. She was right. The fear that had once gripped him, the constant weight of uncertainty, had begun to lift. But there was still so much Blake had to face. The past couldn't be undone, and he had no control over everything that had happened. But he could control how he moved forward. And with Lily by his side, he wasn't alone. He took a deep breath, standing up fully. We're not scared anymore, he said, his voice steady. And I think it's time we start building something for the future. For you, for me, and for everyone here. Lily smiled at him, a bright, open smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was the kind of smile that made Blake feel like maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at happiness after everything they had endured. I'm ready, she said, her voice full of quiet determination. Blake looked out over the park where the laughter of children echoed through the air, and he felt the shift in his chest. It wasn't a full, complete healing, he knew that. But it was a start. And in this moment, that was enough. Later that night, as the town began to quiet down, Blake sat at the edge of the porch of the small house he had made a home. The stars were scattered across the sky, the same stars that had watched over him for so many years, even in his darkest moments. It was a comforting thought. It was as if the universe itself was reminding him that no matter how lost he felt, there was always a way forward. Lily had gone to bed, and for the first time in weeks, Blake was alone with his thoughts. He wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. Instead, it felt like a space for him to finally breathe, to let go of the weight that had been holding him back. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his mistakes, his regrets, and his guilt. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of the night, Blake realized that he couldn't outrun them. They were part of him, but they didn't define him. Blake stood up, looking out into the darkness of the night. There was a long road ahead, a road of healing and rebuilding, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. And for the first time, he felt ready. Blake stood at the edge of the park, his eyes tracing the outlines of the town as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. It felt like a new beginning, even if it wasn't as dramatic as he might have imagined. The weight of the past still clung to him, but there was a subtle shift, a feeling that the future, once uncertain and shrouded in darkness, was finally in his grasp. The world had changed, and so had he. The laughter of children still echoed from the park, but now it carried with it a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. Blake looked down at his hands, the scars of everything he had endured still. Visible but no longer painful. He had earned every one of them. Struggle, the guilt, the loss. They were his to bear, but they didn't have to be his future. Blake? He turned to find Lily standing behind him, her small figure outlined by the soft glow of the rising sun. She looked peaceful, still, carrying that quiet strength that had been her anchor through everything. In her, Blake saw a reflection of the hope that had begun to grow inside of him. She had weathered the storm, and she was ready to walk into the light. "Morning," Blake greeted, his voice warm but thoughtful. He motioned for her to join him, and Lily made her way over, standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the town below them. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It feels like we're starting over." Blake nodded, his heart swelling. "We are, and this time we get to decide what comes next." Lily's face softened, her eyes catching the first rays of sunlight as she looked up at him. "Do you think we can really do it, Blake? Build something better?" Blake's chest tightened at the weight of her question. Could they? Could he, after everything that had happened, rebuild the world around him? The ghosts of the past would always linger, but that didn't mean they had to hold him hostage. "We don't have to do it alone," Blake said firmly, squeezing her hand. "We've already started, Lily. Look around. People are beginning to heal, and that's just the beginning." Lily nodded, her expression resolute. "We've already been through so much, but I think we can be happy again, even if it's different." "It will be different," Blake agreed, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean it won't be good. We just have to build it step by step." Lily looked down at their hands, her fingers still loosely entwined with his. "Together." Blake smiled, his heart full. "Yeah, together." As they stood, there side by side, the town that had once been shrouded in darkness now seemed to shine brighter. Blake didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready for whatever came next. The burden of guilt had not vanished, but it was no longer the thing that defined him. The future was a canvas, and they were the artists. They could choose what came next. The days passed in a blur, the seasons slowly changing as the town began to rebuild in earnest. Blake had taken on a more prominent role in the recovery effort, working alongside Jonathan and Madison to ensure that those who had been affected by the curse received the care and support they needed. The town, once divided by fear and uncertainty, now came together in a way Blake had never imagined. But as time passed, Blake knew that healing didn't just happen in the aftermath of trauma. It was something you chose every day. It was in the small moments of joy, the quiet acts of kindness, and the collective determination to move forward. One afternoon, Blake found himself back in the old house once more. The renovations had continued, and it had transformed from a place of dread to a space for the community to come together. A new sense of purpose had taken root, and it was in these walls that Blake began to see the potential of what they could create. A place for growth, for learning, for connection. It was more than just a building, it was a symbol of resilience. Blake was standing by the window when Madison walked in, her eyes bright but tired. She had been working tirelessly to help the town rebuild, but there was something different about her now. The weight of her past still lingered, but she carried it with a quiet strength that inspired Blake. "I think we've done it," Madison said softly, standing beside him. "I think we're starting to really heal." Blake turned to face her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think you're right." Madison met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "We've both been through so much, Blake, but we're here now, and maybe that's all we really need." Blake nodded, his chest swelling with a sense of gratitude he hadn't realized was building. The town, the people. This was his home, his place to make a difference, and he would do everything in his power to ensure that the darkness that had consumed them never returned. "I think we're ready to write the next chapter," Blake said, his voice steady. Madison smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. Together, for the first time in a long time, Blake felt the full weight of the journey they had taken together. The road had been long, filled with pain and sacrifice, but it had also been filled with moments of triumph, of love, of people coming together to rebuild something stronger than before. As he walked out of the house and into the sunlight, Blake looked around at the world that had been born from the darkness. There was still much to do, many lives to heal, many wounds to mend. But as long as they kept moving forward, as long as they kept choosing to stand together, Blake knew they could face anything. He wasn't running from the past anymore. He was walking toward the future. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. The town had become a reflection of its people, resilient, slowly healing, and undeniably stronger than before. Blake walked the streets with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight on his shoulders no longer as heavy as it once was. He had learned the hard way that healing wasn't a straight line, but he had also learned that healing was possible. Lily, now a little more carefree, was thriving, her laughter echoing through their home and into the world outside. She had become a beacon of the new life they were both building. But no matter how much progress had been made, Blake knew there were still shadows left in the corners of his soul. The past didn't vanish overnight. He'd made peace with it, but some scars ran deeper than others, and Blake had yet to face the final test, the one that could either free him completely or tie him to the past forever. It was late afternoon when Jonathan called him, his voice sharp and urgent. "Blake, meet me at the old house, it's time." The word struck Blake like a lightning bolt. He hadn't been back to the house in weeks. He knew it had become the center for the community, a space for healing and reflection. But the place still held its ghosts, memories of dark times, of things Blake had not fully confronted. "On my way," Blake replied, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. When Blake arrived at the house, the door was open, and he stepped inside, the familiar creaking of the floorboards underfoot. Jonathan was waiting for him in the main room, standing by a table covered with old papers. The shadows from the late afternoon sun stretched across the room, casting long lines over the furniture, the walls. The room felt heavy with history. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jonathan said with a half-smile, his voice soft but carrying a note of tension. Blake didn't smile back. He couldn't. Something about the place, despite all the work they'd done to transform it, still felt wrong. The darkness wasn't fully gone. Not yet. "I'm not sure I've seen a ghost," Blake said quietly. "But I know I haven't faced everything yet." Jonathan nodded, understanding. He moved to the table, gesturing for Blake to join him. "I've been going through the old records. Things related to the curse, its origins, everything that happened with Madison's family. I found something that might help us finally put all of this to rest." Blake's breath caught in his throat. Finally put this to rest. Those words were both a promise and a fear. He had spent so much time and energy fighting, surviving. But was it truly over? Was he ready to let it all go? Jonathan pulled a weathered book from the table, opening it to a page that had clearly been well worn. It was an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, the handwriting cramped and difficult to read. "This is one of the last entries. It's from Madison's great-grandfather. It's about the ritual that bound the curse." Blake leaned in, his eyes scanning the words. "The ritual must continue, no matter the cost. If the bloodline is broken, the curse will remain, but if the curse is completed, the power can be bound forever. Only through sacrifice can the cycle be ended, but the price will always be one of blood." Blake's heart pounded in his chest. He understood the meaning now, the horror of the ritual. The curse hadn't just been something imposed on Madison's family. It was something that had been embedded in their very bloodline. There was no way out, not unless the ritual was completed, unless someone died. Madison's family, her bloodline, Blake murmured as the realization hit him. It was never just about the curse. It was about power. A price that had to be paid. Jonathan nodded grimly. Exactly, the curse had to be fed or it would destroy the family entirely. But the ritual's power wasn't just about keeping them in line. It was about binding something much darker, something older than the family itself. Blake's mind raced, a flood of thoughts and emotions surging through him. "So, it's never really over, is it? The curse, the sacrifice, it will always come back again and again." Jonathan met his gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's always been about control, Blake. Power. And as long as there are people who seek that power, the cycle will continue. But we have a choice now. You have a choice." Blake turned away, his eyes lingering on the old house. The pain, the history, the darkness, It had been inside him, inside this house for so long. Could he truly break free from it? Could anyone? You said we have a choice, Blake said quietly, more to himself than to Jonathan. What kind of choice is that? Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. It's about understanding the truth. The curse was never just about the bloodline. It was about the need for power, the need for sacrifice. But we can break that chain. If we understand it, if we confront it head on, we can make sure that it doesn't come back. That's how we free ourselves, Blake. Blake swallowed hard, his throat tight. And if we don't, what happens if we can't break it? Jonathan's eyes darkened. Then it will keep coming back. Not just for you and Lily, but for everyone who is connected to this place. The people here, our town. It doesn't matter how many generations it takes, the darkness will always find a way. A heavy silence fell between them as Blake's mind grappled with the weight of Jonathan's words. The truth was more terrifying than he could have imagined. They had fought the curse, they had survived it, but survival wasn't enough. They had to destroy it completely, erase it from the fabric of their history. Blake turned back to Jonathan, his eyes clear now. Then, we fight it again. We finish this once and for all, not just for Lily and me, but for everyone, for this town. We'll face it together. Jonathan's face softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. That's the choice, Blake. It's never easy, but it's the only way. Blake took a deep breath. He could feel it, his heart steadying, his resolve hardening. It wasn't just about defeating the curse. It was about confronting it head on, acknowledging the power it had over their lives and taking it back. They weren't done yet. The final step had arrived. Blake stood at the threshold of the old house, the place that had been the epicenter of everything, the darkness, the curse, the suffering. It was now a place of potential healing, but he knew that they weren't truly free until the last remnants of the curse were erased. The shadows still clung to the walls, but Blake could feel the change. He had made a decision. He was going to end it all. For Lily, for the town, for himself. Jonathan stood beside him, his expression serious. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Blake nodded. The weight of the past had prepared him for this moment. He had spent so many years running, fearing the shadows that haunted him. But now he was ready to face them head on. "I have to be, for all of us." Jonathan gave him a long look before turning and walking inside. Blake followed, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. This time it was different. The air was charged, not with the oppressive weight of the curse, but with the finality of the choice he had made. The room was exactly how it had been when they first discovered its significance. The altar, the markings, the stone pillar, it all remained as a reminder of the power that had once been. The air still held traces of what had happened, but Blake could already feel it beginning to dissipate, like smoke fading into the light. They had come full circle. This was where it all began, and now it was where it would end. Madison arrived shortly after, her face tired but determined. "I know we're not done yet," she said quietly, stepping into the room. "But I trust you, Blake. I trust all of us. We have to end it now." Blake looked at her, his chest tight with the weight of everything they had been through together. Madison had faced unimaginable pain, but her strength had been a steady force in their journey. "We will," Blake said, his voice stronger than it had ever been. Together, the book Jonathan had found earlier lay open on the table. Blake walked over to it, his fingers trembling as he traced the pages. The symbols, the rituals, they all made sense now. They weren't just parts of the curse, they were pieces of the puzzle that held the town captive for so long. They had learned to live with it, to survive, but now they would put an end to it once and for all. "Blake," Jonathan said, his voice low. "You know what has to happen, don't you?" Blake looked up from the book, meeting Jonathan's gaze. He did know. The curse had always been about sacrifice. But now, it wasn't about losing anyone else. It was about breaking the cycle. "I'm ready," Blake said. He turned to Madison. "We all are." Lily's voice broke through the momentary silence. "What does that mean?" She had entered quietly, her eyes wide but steady. She had overheard them. She had grown up too quickly, but in that moment Blake could see her, really see her, as a young girl, trying to make sense of the world that had shaped her so far. Blake knelt in front of her, his heart heavy. "It means that we're going to end this once and for all, sweetheart. The curse, the darkness, it ends today." Lily looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, with a small, brave nod, she said, "I'm ready too." The finality of it all hung in the air, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a chance at freedom, a chance to rewrite their story. Blake stood up, taking a deep breath. This was the moment he had feared, but also the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. They stood together, a united front, as Blake approached the altar once again. The symbols etched into the stone pillar glowed faintly in the dim light, as if the curse were still alive, waiting for the sacrifice. But Blake knew it wasn't power that would bind them. It was their will, their decision to end it all. With a steady hand, Blake reached for the old dagger that had been left for centuries as part of the ritual. He held it up, its cold metal, reflecting the dim light. He turned to the others, his voice firm. "This is the final step. Once it's done, it's over. No more cycles, no more sacrifices." Madison, Jonathan, and Lily nodded. There was no fear in their eyes, only determination. Blake pressed the dagger gently into the stone at the base of the pillar. The ground beneath them rumbled slightly, and the symbols on the wall began to glow brighter. He could feel the power in the room, the energy that had once been a force of darkness now shifting, aligning in a way that felt right. He took a deep breath and plunged the dagger into the stone. There was a sudden surge of light, a flash so bright that for a moment everything was swallowed by it. Blake's ears rang, and the world seemed to spin. The light was blinding, and Blake could feel something breaking inside him. Something that had been tied to the curse, something he hadn't even known he was holding on to. Then just as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The room was still. The weight of the curse was gone. Blake collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily. The room was quiet, the air no longer thick with the oppressive energy that had once clung to it. The shadows were gone, and in their place was a peaceful stillness. Lily was the first to speak. "Is it over?" Blake looked up at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over. It's really over." They had done it. They had broken the chain that had bound them for so long. The darkness that had threatened to consume them had finally been banished. And with it, the fear, the guilt, the weight that had plagued Blake for so long. Jonathan clapped Blake on the back, his voice soft but full of relief. "We made it, all of us." Blake smiled, the burden of his past finally lifting. "Yeah, we did." As they left the house, Blake looked around at the town they had saved, at the life that had been rebuilt from the ashes of everything that had come before. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Blake truly felt that they were free. Together, they had broken the chain. Together, they had created a new legacy. And for the first time in years, Blake believed in the possibility of a future.